I lay in bed that night, my body aching and mind racing with the day's events. The image of the gargoyle's glowing red eyes haunted my dreams, the sound of its screeches echoing in my ears. But despite the fear and uncertainty, I couldn't help but feel a sense of exhilaration. This was what I lived for, the thrill of the hunt, the adrenaline of the chase, and I knew deep down that I would never stop, not until every last monster was defeated and the world was safe again. As I drifted off to sleep, a faint smile crossed my lips. Little did I know my next hunt was already lurking in the shadows, waiting to test me in ways I never imagined. I woke the following day to my phone ringing insistently on the nightstand. Groaning, I reached over and picked it up, blinking blearily at the screen. "Grayson," I mumbled, sitting up and rubbing my eyes. "What's up?" "Sorry to wake you," the sheriff said, his voice tense. "But we've got a situation." I was fully awake now, my senses on high alert. "What kind of situation?" "Another body was found just outside of town," the sheriff replied. "It's bad, Grayson. Real bad." "I'll be there as soon as possible," I said, swinging my legs out of bed and reaching for my clothes. "Send me the location." As soon as I hung up, I got dressed and grabbed my gear, my mind racing with possibilities. Another body meant that the threat wasn't over. Whether it was another gargoyle or something else entirely, I needed to find out, and fast. The location the sheriff sent me was an old farmhouse, long since abandoned and falling into disrepair. The place had an air of desolation about it, the kind of place where bad things seem to happen. When I arrived, the sheriff and a handful of deputies were already there. They stood around a body covered with a tarp, their faces pale and drawn. "What do we have?" I asked, approaching the sheriff. He gestured to the body, his expression grim. "See for yourself." I pulled back the tarp, revealing the mutilated remains of what had once been a man. His body was covered in deep, ragged wounds, the kind that could only have been made by something with claws. His face was frozen in a mask of terror, his eyes wide and staring. "Jesus," I muttered, my stomach turning. "This looks like the work of our friend from last night." The sheriff nodded. "That's what I thought too. But look closer." I leaned in, examining the wounds more closely. That's when I noticed it. Tiny puncture marks around the edges of the cuts, almost like bites. "This isn't a gargoyle," I said, my mind racing. "This is something else, something with teeth." The sheriff's face paled even further. "Any idea what we're dealing with?" I shook my head. "Not yet, but I intend to find out." I spent the next several hours combing through the farmhouse and the surrounding area, looking for any clues that might point to what we were dealing with. The place was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of decay. As I made my way through the dilapidated house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind sent a shiver down my spine. Finally, I found something, a series of claw marks on the walls, similar to the ones on the victim's body. The marks were deep and jagged, carved into the wood with brutal force. Whatever had made these marks was strong, and it was still out there. I followed the trail of claw marks, leading me to the basement. The air grew colder as I descended the stairs, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The smell of decay grew stronger, almost overwhelming. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it, a nest built out of old rags and debris, hidden in the darkest corner of the basement. And in the center of the nest, a pair of glowing eyes stared back at me. "Oh God," I whispered, raising my weapon. The creature stepped out of the shadows, revealing itself in the beam of my flashlight. It was smaller than the gargoyle, but no less terrifying. Its body was covered in matted fur, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Long, sharp fangs protruded from its mouth, dripping with blood. A Wendigo. I'd heard stories about these creatures. Cannibalistic spirits that haunted the forests, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. I'd never encountered one before, but I knew enough to be afraid. The Wendigo let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes fixed on me. I took a step back, my finger tightening on the trigger. "All right, you ugly creature," I muttered. "Let's see what you've got." I fired a shot, the bullet hitting the Wendigo square in the chest. It let out a screech of pain, but instead of falling, it charged at me, its claws outstretched. I dodged to the side, firing again and again. The Wendigo was fast, faster than I expected, and it was all I could do to keep up. My bullets seemed to slow it down, but not by much. Finally, I managed to land a shot to its head, and the creature collapsed to the ground, twitching. I didn't wait to see if it was dead. I rushed forward, pulling out my silver knife and plunging it into the Wendigo's heart. The creature let out one last agonized screech before falling silent, its body convulsing as the life drained out of it. I stood there panting, my heart racing. I couldn't believe I'd done it, taken down a Wendigo and lived to tell the tale. I quickly set about securing the body, tying its limbs together with sturdy ropes. As I worked, I couldn't help but marvel at the creature's sheer ferocity. This was no ordinary monster. It was a nightmare made flesh. With the Wendigo secured, I made my way back upstairs, my mind still racing. If there was one Wendigo, there could be more. I needed to find out where it came from and whether there were others lurking in the shadows. When I emerged from the farmhouse, the sheriff was waiting for me, his eyes wide with shock. "Holy Christ, Grayson," he said, taking in the sight of the Wendigo's body. "What the hell is that thing?" "Oh, Wendigo," I replied, my voice grim. "And I think there might be more of them." The sheriff's face paled. "More? How many?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I intend to find out." Over the next few days, I worked tirelessly to track down any leads on the Wendigo's origin. I scoured old records, interviewed locals, and followed every clue I could find. Finally, my efforts paid off. I discovered an old legend passed down through generations about a cursed forest where Wendigos were said to dwell. According to the legend, the forest was a place of great evil, where dark rituals were performed and human sacrifices were made. It was the perfect hiding place for a nest of Wendigos. Armed with this new information, I set out for the cursed forest, determined to put an end to the Wendigo threat once and for all. The sheriff insisted on coming with me, despite my protests. He was a brave man, and I couldn't deny that I could use the help. The forest was dark and foreboding. The trees twisted and gnarled as if they had grown under some malevolent force. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and an eerie silence hung over the place. As we made our way deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. Finally, we came across a clearing, and I knew we had found the Wendigo's nest. The ground was littered with bones, and the air was thick with the stench of death. The sheriff and I moved cautiously, our weapons at the ready. As we approached the center of the clearing, a low growl echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. "They're here," I whispered, my grip tightening on my rifle. The Wendigos emerged from the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on us. There were at least half a dozen of them, their bodies twisted and emaciated, their fangs bared in a menacing snarl. "This is it," I said, my voice steady. "Remember, aim for the heart. Silver bullets and knives only." The sheriff nodded, his face set in determination. "Let's do this." The Wendigos charged at us, their claws outstretched. We fired our rifles, the bullets hitting their marks and sending the creatures screeching to the ground. But there were too many of them, and they were fast. One of the Wendigos lunged at me, its claws raking across my arm. I cried out in pain, but managed to stab it in the chest with my silver knife. The creature let out a final screech before collapsing to the ground. The sheriff was holding his own, firing shot after shot at the advancing Wendigos. But it was clear that we were outnumbered, and I knew we couldn't keep this up for long. "Fall back," I shouted, retreating towards the edge of the clearing. "We need to regroup." The sheriff followed my lead, and we managed to put some distance between us and the Wendigos, but the creatures were relentless, and they weren't about to let us go without a fight. As we reached the edge of the clearing, I spotted a narrow cave entrance, half hidden by overgrown vines. "In here," I called, pulling the sheriff towards the cave. We ducked into the cave, the Wendigos hot on our heels. Inside, it was pitch black, the air cold and damp. I could hear the creatures snarling and clawing at the entrance, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. "Keep moving," I whispered to the sheriff, my voice barely audible over the sound of the Wendigo's growls. "We need to find a way out of here." The sheriff nodded, his face pale with fear. "What if there isn't a way out?" "There has to be," I replied, more to convince myself than him. "Just keep moving." We made our way deeper into the cave, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The Wendigo's growls grew fainter as we put distance between us and the entrance, but I knew they wouldn't give up that easily. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a large chamber, the walls covered in strange ancient markings. In the center of the chamber was a pool of water, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. "What is this place?" the sheriff asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, my eyes scanning the chamber. "But I have a feeling we're about to find out." As if on cue, the Wendigos burst into the chamber, their eyes glowing with a feral hunger. I raised my rifle, but before I could fire, a voice echoed through the chamber, stopping us all in our tracks. "Enough." The voice was deep and resonant, filled with an undeniable authority. The Wendigos froze, their eyes darting around the chamber as if searching for the source of the voice. I turned, my flashlight beam falling on a figure standing at the far end of the chamber. He was tall and gaunt, his eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the Wendigos. He wore tattered robes and his skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, my rifle trained on the figure. The man smiled, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent intelligence. "I am Thaddeus, the keeper of this place. And you, Jackson Grayson, are trespassing." "How do you know my name?" I asked, my grip tightening on my rifle. "I know many things," Thaddeus replied, his voice calm and measured. "I know that you have been hunting my children, and I know that you seek to destroy them." I glanced at the Wendigos, their eyes fixed on Thaddeus with a mix of fear and reverence. "Your children?" I repeated, my mind racing. "So you mean these things?" Thaddeus nodded. "They are the last of their kind, the remnants of a forgotten age. I have protected them for centuries, kept them hidden from those who would seek to harm them, and now you have come to finish what others have started." "They're monsters," I said, my voice filled with anger. "They've killed innocent people. They're only doing what they must to survive," Thaddeus replied. "Just as you are doing what you must." I shook my head, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. "This doesn't make any sense. Why are you protecting them?" "Because they are all that remains of a once great civilization," Thaddeus said, his eyes filled with sadness. "A civilization that was destroyed by the very creatures they sought to protect. And now I am the last of their guardians." The sheriff stepped forward, his face pale with fear. "What do you want from us?" Thaddeus sighed, his shoulders sagging with the weight of centuries. "I want you to leave this place. Leave my children in peace and they will not harm you." I glanced at the sheriff, his eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. "And if we refuse, then you will die," Thaddeus said simply, his eyes cold and unyielding. I took a deep breath, my mind racing with possibilities. I didn't want to fight, but I couldn't just walk away and leave these creatures to continue their reign of terror. "We can't do that," I said, my voice firm. "These things have killed too many people. They need to be stopped." Thaddeus's eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger crossing his face. "Very well. Then you have made your choice." With a wave of his hand, the Wendigos lunged at us, their claws outstretched. I fired my rifle, the bullet striking their marks and sending the creatures screeching to the ground. But there were too many of them, and they kept coming, their eyes filled with a feral hunger. The sheriff and I fought with everything we had, our bullets and knives cutting through the Wendigos' ranks. But it was clear that we were outnumbered, and I knew we couldn't keep this up for long. Just when I thought all hope was lost, a blinding light filled the chamber, causing the Wendigos to recoil in pain. I turned, my eyes widening in shock as I saw Thaddeus, his body glowing with an ethereal light. "Enough," he shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Leave them be." The Wendigos hesitated, their eyes darting between us and Thaddeus. Finally they backed away, their growls fading as they retreated into the shadows. Thaddeus approached us, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You have proven yourselves worthy adversaries," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I cannot allow you to destroy my children." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "Then what do you propose?" Thaddeus sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I will give you a choice. Leave this place and never return, or stay and face the consequences." I glanced at the sheriff, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. "What do you think?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff took a deep breath, his eyes filled with determination. "We can't just walk away, Grayson. We have to finish this." I nodded, my mind made up. "All right, Thaddeus. We'll stay and fight." Thaddeus's eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger crossing his face. "Very well. Then you have sealed your fate." With a wave of his hand, the Wendigos lunged at us once more, their claws outstretched. I fired my rifle, the bullets striking their marks and sending the creatures screeching to the ground. But there were too many of them, and they kept coming, their eyes filled with a feral hunger. The sheriff and I fought with everything we had, our bullets and knives cutting through the Wendigos' ranks. But it was clear that we were outnumbered, and I knew we couldn't keep this up for long. Just when I thought all hope was lost, a blinding light filled the chamber, causing the Wendigos to recoil in pain. I turned, my eyes widening in shock as I saw Thaddeus, his body glowing with an ethereal light. "Enough," he shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Leave them be." The Wendigos hesitated, their eyes darting between us and Thaddeus. Finally they backed away, their growls fading as they retreated into the shadows. Thaddeus approached us, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You have proven yourselves worthy adversaries," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I cannot allow you to destroy my children." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "Then what do you propose?" Thaddeus sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I will give you a choice. Leave this place and never return, or stay and face the consequences." I glanced at the sheriff, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. "What do you think?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff took a deep breath, his eyes filled with determination. "We can't just walk away, Grayson. We have to finish this." I nodded, my mind made up. "All right, Thaddeus. We'll stay and fight." Thaddeus's eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger crossing his face. "Very well. Then you have sealed your fate." With a wave of his hand, the Wendigos lunged at us once more, their claws outstretched. I fired my rifle, the bullets striking their marks and sending the creatures screeching to the ground. But there were too many of them, and they kept coming, their eyes filled with a feral hunger. The sheriff and I fought with everything we had, our bullets and knives cutting through the Wendigos' ranks. But it was clear that we were outnumbered, and I knew we couldn't keep this up for long. Just when I thought all hope was lost, a blinding light filled the chamber, causing the Wendigos to recoil in pain. I turned, my eyes widening in shock as I saw Thaddeus, his body glowing with an ethereal light. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Leave them be." The Wendigos hesitated, their eyes darting between us and Thaddeus. Finally they backed away, their growls fading as they retreated into the shadows. Thaddeus approached us, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You have proven yourselves worthy adversaries," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I cannot allow you to destroy my children." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "Then what do you propose?" Thaddeus's eyes softened, a look of resignation crossing his face. "I do not wish for more bloodshed. Perhaps there is another way. A truce of sorts." The sheriff and I exchanged wary glances. "A truce?" I echoed, skeptical. "What kind of truce?" Thaddeus sighed, his shoulders slumping. "You have seen what my children are capable of, but you must understand they do not kill out of malice. They kill because they must feed. If we could find a way to sustain them without harming humans, perhaps we could coexist." I frowned, my mind racing with possibilities. "And how do you suggest we do that?" "There are ancient rituals, forgotten by time," Thaddeus replied. "Rituals that could bind them to this place, so they do not leave and harm others. It would require a great deal of power and sacrifice, but it is possible." The sheriff stepped forward, his face set in determination. "If we agree to this truce, will your children cease their attacks?" Thaddeus nodded solemnly. "Yes, I will ensure they do." I glanced at the sheriff, seeing the same resolve in his eyes. "All right, Thaddeus, we'll help you. But if you go back on your word, we'll destroy every last one of them." Thaddeus inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Very well. Follow me." He led us deeper into the cave, to a hidden chamber filled with ancient runes and symbols etched into the walls. In the center of the chamber was a large stone altar, its surface covered in intricate carvings. "This is the place," Thaddeus said, gesturing to the altar. "We will need to perform the binding ritual here." The sheriff and I helped Thaddeus prepare the ritual, gathering the necessary ingredients and lighting the ceremonial candles. As we worked, Thaddeus explained the steps of the ritual, his voice filled with an ancient knowledge that both fascinated and unnerved me. Finally, we were ready. Thaddeus stood at the altar, his eyes glowing with an ethereal light as he began to chant in a language I didn't recognize. The air in the chamber grew thick with power, the very walls seeming to hum with energy. As Thaddeus continued the chant, the Wendigos emerged from the shadows, their eyes fixed on the altar. They moved in unison, forming a circle around us, their growls low and menacing. "Stay close," I whispered to the sheriff, my grip tightening on my rifle. The sheriff nodded, his face pale but resolute. The chanting reached a crescendo, and a blinding light filled the chamber. The Wendigos howled in pain, their bodies writhing as the power of the ritual took hold. Thaddeus raised his hands, his voice booming with authority. "By the ancient rites I bind you to this place. You shall not leave, you shall not harm. Your hunger shall be sated, and you shall live in peace." The light grew even brighter, and the Wendigos let out one final agonized screech before collapsing to the ground. When the light faded, the chamber was silent, the Wendigos lying still and unmoving. Thaddeus lowered his hands, his eyes dimming as he turned to us. "It is done. They are bound to this place. They will not harm anyone again." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my heart finally beginning to slow. Thank you, Thaddeus. Let's hope this works. The sheriff nodded, his face filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It's over. We did it. Thaddeus gave us a tired smile. Yes, it is over. And now you must go. Leave this place and never return. I glanced at the sheriff, then back at Thaddeus. We'll leave. But if we hear of any more attacks, we'll be back. Thaddeus nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. I will hold you to that. Farewell, Jackson Grayson. May you find peace in your hunts. With that, the sheriff and I made our way out of the cave, the weight of the night's events heavy on our shoulders. As we emerged into the cool night air, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. We had done it. We had stopped the Wendigos, at least for now. The sheriff turned to me, a tired but grateful smile on his face. Thanks, Grayson. I don't think we could have done this without you. I clapped him on the shoulder. Just doing my job, Sheriff. Let's get back to town. I could use a stiff drink. The drive back to town was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. When we finally arrived, the sheriff dropped me off at my place, his face etched with fatigue. You take care of yourself, Grayson, he said, his voice sincere. And if we ever need your help again, you know where to find me, I replied with a grin. Stay safe, Sheriff. As I watched him drive away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. We had faced incredible odds and come out on top, but I knew this was just one battle in a never-ending war. There would always be more